On a warm summer weekend in January 1982, a mother of two vanished from Sydney's northern beaches. 33-year-old Lynette Dawson was a registered nurse and a devoted mother to her young daughters, Chanel and Sharon. The evening before she disappeared, Lynn had attended marriage counselling with her husband, Chris Dawson. Later that night, she spoke with her mother on the phone. The following day, she was expected to meet family members for a picnic at Northbridge Baths. She never arrived. In the days that followed, those closest to Lynn were told she had simply gone away and needed time to herself. But as the weeks passed and the silence continued, that explanation became harder to believe. What began as a missing persons case would evolve into one of Australia's longest running and most controversial criminal investigations, spanning decades, multiple coronial inquests, a determined family who refused to give up hope, and a podcast that would ultimately reignite national interest in the mystery. This is the story of Lynette Dawson. In the summer of 1982, Lynette Dawson was living what appeared to be a comfortable family life on Sydney's northern beaches. At 33 years old, she shared a home in Bayview with her husband, Chris, and their two young daughters, Chanel and Sharon. To family and friends, she was simply known as Lynn. She was described as caring, devoted, and deeply committed to those she loved. Born in 1948, Lynn had spent much of her life in Sydney before meeting Chris at a high school function in 1965. Both were just 16 years old. Their relationship would continue throughout their late teens and early adulthood before they married in 1970 at St Jude's Church in Randwick. By 1982, they had spent almost half their lives together. The couple eventually settled in Bayview, where they built a life and raised their two daughters. Chris Dawson was well known throughout the area. During the 1970s, he and his identical twin brother Paul played rugby league for the Newtown Jets and were members of the club's 1973 championship winning team. After football, both brothers became physical education teachers. Chris taught primarily at Cromer High School on Sydney's northern beaches. From the outside, the Dawson family appeared settled. They lived in one of Sydney's most desirable coastal communities and were raising two young children. But behind the image of family life, the marriage was under strain. As 1982 began, Lynn and Chris were attempting to repair their relationship. On Friday, the 8th of January 1982, they attended a marriage counselling session together. Later that evening, Lynn's mother, Helena Sims, telephoned the family home. According to family members, Lynn sounded optimistic. She believed the counselling session had been productive and told her mother that things were going to be all right. It would be the last known conversation between them. The following day should have been an ordinary family outing. Lynn was expected to meet her mother Helena and other relatives for a picnic at Northbridge Baths in Sydney. But as the morning passed, Lynn never appeared. Chris Dawson arrived with the couple's two young daughters. At some point during the day, according to later evidence, Chris received a phone call. He subsequently told Helena that Lynn had decided she needed some time away. The explanation was difficult to understand. Helena had spoken with her daughter less than 24 hours earlier. Lynn had sounded positive and hopeful about the future. Now she had apparently left without warning, without saying goodbye and without contacting anyone she loved. As concern began to spread through the family, Chris maintained that Lynn had left voluntarily. At first, some accepted that explanation, but the longer the silence continued, the harder it became to believe. Greg Sims and Pat Jenkins knew their sister well. Lynn was close to her family and regularly kept in touch. It was completely out of character for her to disappear without a word. Then another development began raising even more questions. During 1981, Chris had begun a relationship with one of his students, 16-year-old Joanne Curtis. Joanne had spent time at the Dawson family home after experiencing difficulties with her own family. But within days of Lynn's disappearance, Joanne moved into the Bayview residence. For Lynn's family, the timing was impossible to ignore. Days became weeks, weeks became months, yet Lynn made no contact. Despite her disappearance, Chris did not immediately report his wife missing. It would be the 18th of February 1982 which was more than 6 weeks after Lynn vanished before a missing persons report was finally lodged with police. When investigators began asking questions, Chris continued to insist that Lynn had left on her own account. Over time, a series of explanations emerged. Family members were told she may have joined a religious organisation, moved to New Zealand, or started a life somewhere else. But none of these claims could be verified. For Helena Sims, the uncertainty became unbearable. Armed with photographs of her daughter, she travelled to places where Lynn was supposedly seen. She contacted hospitals, police stations and charitable organisations, following every lead no matter how unlikely. She refused to stop searching. As police examined the circumstances surrounding Lynette Dawson's disappearance, what had begun as a missing persons case was slowly becoming something far more troubling. As the years passed, Lynette Dawson remained missing, yet Greg Sims, Pat Jenkins and their mother Helena refused to believe that Lynn had willingly abandoned her children. In 1983, Chris obtained a divorce. The following year he married Joanne Curtis. Years later, that marriage would also come to an end. After separating from Chris, Joanne approached police with concerns about Lynn's disappearance. She told investigators that Chris had discussed hiring a hitman to kill his former wife. Despite continued investigations, little progress was made. By the mid-1990s, the case appeared to have gone cold. Then, in 1997, Detective Sergeant Damien Loon reopened the investigation, but he found that many of the original police records had been destroyed. According to Loon, little remained beyond a missing person's file number and Lynn's name. The investigation would have to begin almost from scratch. As the investigation expanded, police carefully examined claims that Lynn had started a new life elsewhere, but the evidence simply wasn't there. The deeper investigators looked, the more unusual her disappearance appeared. Police also searched the Bayview property. Excavations were conducted around the home and swimming pool as investigators searched for evidence. During searches conducted in 1999 and 2000, investigators recovered a pink cardigan believed to belong to Lynette Dawson from an area near the pool. The garment contained a number of cuts through the fabric that later attracted significant attention. Yet despite the discovery, police were unable to discover how the cardigan came to be buried there, and no human remains were found. Then, in February 2001, the case reached a major turning point. Deputy State Coroner Jan Stevenson reviewed the evidence and reached a devastating conclusion. Lynette Dawson was deceased and had most likely been murdered by a person known to her. For Lynn's family, it was the strongest official acknowledgement yet that their fears had been justified. The coroner recommended that criminal charges be considered, but the relief was short-lived. The Director of Public Prosecutions determined there was insufficient evidence to proceed. For Greg, Pat and Helena, it was another heartbreaking setback. Tragically, Helena Sims would never see the case resolved. After spending nearly 2 decades searching for her daughter, she died before the answers could be found. A second coronial inquest was held in 2003. Once again, witnesses gave evidence. Once again, Joanne Curtis's testimony attracted significant attention. And, once again, the conclusion was much the same. State Coroner Karl Milovanovich found that Lynette Dawson was dead and recommended that Chris Dawson be charged with her murder. Yet no prosecution followed. Authorities maintained there was insufficient evidence to secure a conviction. As the years continued to pass, many feared the truth would never be known. Then, in 2015, detectives from the New South Wales Unsolved Homicide Unit established a strike force to re-examine the case. But it wasn't until 2018, when an Australian journalist named Hedley Thomas began investigating the disappearance for a new podcast called The Teacher's Pet, that things would start to change. What followed would transform the case and bring unprecedented public attention to the mystery. The series examined Lynn's disappearance in extraordinary detail and attracted an estimated audience of 60 million listeners around the world. Almost overnight, a case that had faded from public view was back in the national spotlight. People who had never heard of Lynette Dawson suddenly knew her story, and investigators once again found themselves under intense public scrutiny. In September 2018, police returned to the Bayview home where Lynn had last been seen. Using modern forensic techniques unavailable during the earlier investigations, detectives conducted an extensive excavation of several locations around the property, including areas near the swimming pool and clothesline. Investigators were revisiting what they described as ground anomalies that had attracted attention during previous searches. The excavations lasted several days and generated widespread media coverage. Although no human remains were discovered, the renewed search demonstrated that police were not giving up on finding answers. For Lynn's family, it offered a renewed sense of hope. On the 5th of December 2018, Chris Dawson was arrested in Queensland and charged with the murder of his wife. The following day, he was extradited to New South Wales to face court. For the first time since Lynn's disappearance in January 1982, the case was heading towards a criminal trial. What followed was a lengthy legal process. Court challenges and delays stretched on for years as preparations were made for one of Australia's most closely watched murder trials. Eventually, in May 2022, proceedings began in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. Because of the extensive publicity surrounding the case, Chris Dawson elected to be tried by a judge sitting alone rather than by a jury. Over 10 weeks, the court examined evidence stretching back more than 4 decades. Witnesses gave evidence about the final days of Lynn's life, the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, and the years that followed. The prosecution alleged that Chris Dawson had murdered Lynette in order to pursue what is described as an unfettered relationship with Joanne Curtis. The defence maintained that Lynn had voluntarily left her family and started a new life elsewhere. Chris Dawson chose not to give evidence during the trial. Then on the 30th of August 2022, the moment Lynn's family had waited decades for finally arrived. Justice Ian Harrison delivered his verdict.
Evidence does not reveal how Mr. Dawson killed Lynette Dawson. It does not reveal whether he did so with the assistance of anyone else or by himself. It does not reveal where or when he did so, nor does it reveal where Lynette Dawson's body is now. The charge of murder in this trial is unsupported by direct evidence. The case against Mr. Dawson is wholly circumstantial. It is therefore necessary that the Crown persuade me beyond reasonable doubt not only that Mr. Dawson's guilt is a rational inference, but that it is the only rational inference that the circumstances would enable me to draw. The circumstantial evidence in this case, considered as a whole, is persuasive and compelling. None of the circumstances considered alone can establish Mr. Dawson's guilt, but when regard is had to their combined force, I am left in no doubt. I am satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the only rational inference that the circumstances enable me to draw is that Lynette Dawson died on about 8 January 1982 as the result of a conscious and voluntary act committed by Mr. Dawson with the intention of causing her death. Christopher Michael Dawson, on the charge that on or about 8 January 1982 at Bayview or elsewhere in the state of New South Wales, you did murder Lynette Dawson. I find you guilty. You may sit down.
More than 40 years after Lynn vanished, a court had finally concluded that she'd been murdered. On the 2nd of December 2022, Chris Dawson was sentenced to 24 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 18 years. For those who had spent a lifetime searching for the truth, the sentence represented a measure of justice. Yet one important question remains unanswered. Where is Lynette Dawson's body? The woman who vanished from Sydney's northern beaches in January 1982 has never been brought home. But after more than 40 years of searching, one thing is no longer in doubt. Lynette Dawson did not abandon her family. And after a lifetime spent searching for answers, those who loved her finally learned the truth.